This is Reaganism, a podcast dedicated to exploring where the Reagan movement lives today. I'm Roger Zakheim, your host, director of the Ronald Reagan Institute in Washington, D.C.
On this episode of Reaganism, Roger speaks with Dr. Henry Now, professor emeritus at George Washington University and the author of, among other books, Conservative Internationalism, Armed Diplomacy Under Jefferson, Polk, Truman, and Reagan. He also worked on international economic issues on the White House National Security Council under President Reagan. Roger and Henry discussed his recent article in National Review titled, Why Reagan Matters.
Dr. Henry Now, welcome to the show.
Good to be here, Roger. Thank you.
Henry, you're a professor emeritus at George Washington University and the author, among other books, of Conservative Internationalism, Armed Diplomacy Under Jefferson, Polk, Truman, and Reagan, unifying Jefferson and Polk with, and Truman, of course, with Ronald Reagan. Perhaps not intuitive to many, but we'll get into that a little bit. You come to this moment not only as a scholar, but also as a veteran of the Reagan administration. You worked on the White House National Security Council on international economic issues from January 1981 to September 1983. Why don't we start with you telling us how an academic trained in political science got to the Reagan White House?
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you, Roger, not only for this opportunity, but also for all you're doing here for the Institute. Now, I say that not only because it's true, but maybe because it'll also make you ask easier questions. My students would often ask that question, and I would tell them, look, it was where preparation met opportunity, and that, I guess, constitutes luck. I was a young faculty member. I had published my first book on nuclear power developments, peaceful nuclear power developments in Europe. And came to Washington after an early stint at Williams College to teach, and then found myself being invited to conferences dealing with nuclear power. There I met at some point some of the people who were to serve in the Reagan administration. Even though I disagreed with some aspects, I was not a Reagan supporter in the 1970s. We had a certain chemistry, especially Dick Allen and I, who was Reagan's first national security advisor. And so eventually he offered me the position to be on the board of advisors and then on transition teams after Reagan won, and finally on the National Security Council in the NSC. So it was a opportunity of a lifetime. I had a fantastic learning experience and felt, in retrospect, obviously feel like that was a moment when a major contribution was made to the future.
Yeah,
the betterment and the future of the country.
No question, that was a consequential period. Of course, you were there from 1981 to 1983 during the build-up, really kind of the confrontation period between the United States and the Soviet Union. Reagan, of course, famously didn't have anybody to speak with. They were all dying on him. That is the leaders in the Soviet Union at the time. But you were focusing on, you came to this world because of your work on nukes, but you ended up attending G7 summits and supporting the National Security Council and the Reagan administration that way. Tell us about your work within the National Council and participating in G7 summits.
That's a good point. Yeah, I was working on a book actually in the late 70s on food and energy. So I was moving into the economic areas, away from sort of the technology areas. The nuclear book I had done was on peaceful nuclear cooperation in Europe, Euratom, European Atomic Energy Community. So now I started working on sort of elements of the global economy, especially, of course, oil and gas and energy. That was, a lead-in then to sort of what I eventually did in the Reagan administration. I'd become a student to some extent of the G7 summits and knew the people in the academic world who were writing about them. And so I was intrigued by that. I remember when I suggested to Dick Allen that, look, let me handle these international economic issues. He said, well, are you an economist? I said, well, yeah, that's actually in my degree from MIT, politics, economics, and science. And so I told him.
And he bought it.
And he bought it.
Because you're a political scientist by training,
yeah,
right?
Exactly.
Any recollections or moments, the particular summit that stands out in your mind that kind of formed your thinking, or perhaps was just like a great opportunity for you to be in the room when it happened?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I was the note taker at the Versailles summit, and that was a summit that was very confrontational. When we were unable to reach some agreements, obviously with the Allies, the U.S. economy was still in the tank. so to speak. And of course, the Cold War relationships were heating up. So there were lots of differences at that conferences, but in some sense, that conference that summit set the stage for the following summit, the Williamsburg Summit, where in fact most of Reagan's
Williamsburg, Virginia, where
Williamsburg,
we hosted, right?
Where most of Reagan's policies began to appear. They, for example, issued a declaration affirming the deployment of the intermediate nuclear force missiles in Europe, which was a major step forward in, balancing the situation with
the so-called Euro missiles. Yeah?
Euro missiles, correct. The economy was beginning to emerge. In spring of 1983, the economy grew for the first time. So things were beginning to and Williamsburg really did affirm in a very, very important way almost all of the policies, strategic as well as economic, that Reagan had initiated and for a couple of years, of course, had not seen much progress. So I think the Williamsburg Summit for me was a real turning point. And indeed, in retrospect, it remains a key turning point.
It just caught my attention as you're reflecting on Williamsburg, that at a G7 summit, the subject matter, security matter, like missiles, Euro missiles, would find that subject in a declaration. And of course, it was a battle for the Reagan administration and President Reagan to get those missiles on the continent. And of course, President Reagan was doing that and other things on the security front, again, to try to position the United States and its allies in a position of strength. Correct. So that the United States would have a better shot at what Reagan would call, a true peace, a real kind of negotiating from a position of strength and making sure the Soviet Union would kind of engage and negotiate honestly. What was the place of why was that not limited to NATO? Why was that something that G7 summit might take up?
This was the first time that was done at an economic summit. So you're right. There was quite a bit of preliminary negotiation and planning that had to take place. But Reagan insisted upon it. He said, look, these are the countries that matter. We'll include Japan because Japan needs friends in Asia. And in fact, there was an exchange between him and Mitterrand and Nakasone on the patio outside the summit meeting at Williamsburg, in which Mitterrand was saying to Nakasone that, look, I mean, this is an economic summit, and this is a European, sort of primarily European gathering. We shouldn't be doing these things that involve you. Well, Nakasone said, wait a minute. We're alone in Asia. We need you here in the summit process. And Reagan was standing there, and Nakasone sort of, Mitterrand sort of made the comment that, well, we simply can't include you. And Reagan then said, oh, no, yes, we can, because we must pass this G7 statement on strategic policy involving Japan, because the missiles were linked in Asia and in Europe. By the way, the other thing that was very new about the Williamsburg Summit was that it was spontaneous. We had arranged for a whole hour and a half of conversation among the leaders themselves with nobody else in the room. Now, the translators were up in booths outside the room, but they addressed each other very informally. It was also the first summit in which the communique was drafted at the summit. We had no bracketed language going into the summit.
Nothing pre-coded.
We had a thematic paper where we had simply outlined what the issues were. But the differences, they took the differences with them into the summit, and they resolved those differences in the course of the summit.
Fascinating, that story, the way you're talking about Mitterrand, the French president, and then Nakasone, the leader in Japan, and how European security issues and issues in Asia, were linked. Of course, today, as we think about dealing with, well, perhaps obvious or maybe not. We have a debate over the United States' role, and we'll get to this in a little bit in terms of conservative internationalism, but how we should respond to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And there's some very influential voices that really want to limit, as you know, Henry, the U.S. role in Europe because they want the U.S. to focus on Asia. And then there's a counter argument, which I subscribe to, and I imagine you do as well, that the U.S. needs to be present and leading in both, and security is linked in both. If you're absent in one, not only will it, of course, that be a risk for us in that region, but actually it undermines our ability to be effective in another region. I mean, that little anecdote about France and Japan kind of jumps out at me.
That was the beginning of the unification of the free countries, Asia and Europe. And I think I agree with you completely. We need to deal with issues in both regions simultaneously. Now, I do believe that what we ought to try to do is to get the European allies to take the lead in Europe.
Yes.
And back them up.
Right.
They have to take the lead. And then we take the lead in Asia, where we're already focusing primarily on China, and they back us up. The UK-Australian nuclear submarine pact, for example, is an example of that.
Right.
And we have to keep an even hand, I think, between the European region and the Asian region. To designate one as more important than the other, I think would undermine freedom.
Yeah, well, you mentioned AUKUS. That's a huge development out in terms of Asian security. But in NATO, of course, one of the big developments since the Russia's invasion of Ukraine, of course, is you have Finland and Sweden's ascension to NATO. You have some conservatives. Actually, it turned out in the Senate vote, only one or two. One didn't vote, one voted against, but a pretty strong vote across the board, bipartisan amongst Republicans supporting that, which, again, I think certainly when you look at Finland and NATO, those are two countries that really do invest in their defense and strengthens NATO. How do you see that?
Well, this is a major, I think, turning point, or not turning point, but just a Rubicon that the NATO countries have crossed, because, I mean, for 75 years, where you've had Finland and Sweden maintaining a neutral position. This has to be registered in the Kremlin as a severe setback.
Huge loss, right?
And largely because of their, aggressive behavior without any real rationale behind it. I mean, not only has Putin done something that's hard to explain, he hasn't tried to explain it, except in terms of this idea that NATO threatens them. Well, I mean, exactly what territory was NATO about to see?
We invaded,
there wasn't any such. And if we threaten him, that is, if NATO countries threaten Russia because we're free and his country isn't, there's nothing we can do about that. We have to just stand up to that confrontation. But the other point was a conservative's concern about, the United States carrying too much of the burden. There needs to be more burden sharing. When it comes to Finland and Sweden, these are countries that, even though they have not been part of NATO, maybe for that reason, they've invested significantly in their defense, and they're border countries. Which means that they're going to be putting troops on the border, which is exactly where you need. It took us a long time to get the Germans, in particular, to kind of do that after World War II. Great
point. We'll probably jump back to this. We talk about conservative internationalism today, something that you've been writing and thinking about and really leading on for a long time. But I want to jump to a piece you recently wrote in National Review, one that caught our attention. Once I read the title, it'll be obvious why. The title is Why Reagan Matters. Henry, explain to us why you chose to use this moment in time to give a really thorough I won't quite say defense, but argument for why Reagan matters. And it's an argument that covers the landscape both from domestic politics all the way to, kind of foreign policy and national security. Outline the rationale. Well, give us the rationale for running it and the argument.
For some time now, as the decades have passed since Reagan, I have been arguing that there were two transformative presidents in the 20th century, and it becomes clearer and clearer as the decades move on. They are, in fact, Franklin Roosevelt and Ronald Reagan. And they did similar things. I mean, you can maybe still argue that Roosevelt faced the more difficult circumstances, but they won a war, one of them a hot war, the other a cold war. They took an economy that was in a deep depression or recession, and by the way, that's still the worst recession we've had since the deep depression that Reagan confronted in the early 1980s, lifted the country to victory in both of those areas, turned the world economy around, and then renewed America's faith and confidence in itself. The two of them, they ushered in eras of sort of the liberal American kind of vision of who we are, and then with Reagan, the conservative. Both, by the way, a part of the republic that was founded in the early, in the late 1700s. So it seemed to me that one wants to understand. For many years, by the way, I've been frustrated by the fact that the conservatives have had no legacy like the Roosevelt legacy. And we haven't cultivated that. And now we have a chance to cultivate that with Reagan, because he did these very significant things. By the way, also got his own party re-elected after he left office.
Right.
Only two presidents to do that in the 20th century. So, I think that Reagan did three things, basically. I'll just outline
the argument.
details. He first demonstrated how you unite the Republican Party and bring the Republican Party into power after a long period of not being in power. People forget that. I mean, the Republicans were always a minority party throughout most of the 20th century. And he brought them back. And believe me, that's pretty relevant to today, it seems to me. We have to be thinking about how we can unite these different elements that constitute the conservative or the Republican Party. Secondly,
that's one reason why he matters now.
That's why he matters now.
We need to unite the party, and that was the recipe there.
He had this wonderful sort of aphorism that he always, uttered, namely that don't speak evil of another Republican. He was trying to contend with what were severe divisions in the Republican Party at that time, and he did it very well. I mean, he basically would always say to people, look, when a group supports me, I'm not supporting their policies, they're supporting my policies. And so he had this big tent sort of vision of where the Republican Party could go. And by the way, a big tent vision of a conservative America. He said, if we just understand that America is a conservative country, I mean, we're 60%, 65% of the voters out there, and behave that way, we'll be a majority party.
You're talking about Reagan Democrats.
I'm talking about the Reagan Democrats, correct.
All right, so unity. That was one reason why it matters.
Yes. Two is, of course, the way he approached the Cold War. For him, it was very important. The ideological confrontation was very important. I mean, Reagan saw the world in terms of good and evil, and he certainly believed that free societies were good and that the authoritarian, totalitarian societies were evil. And he understood that that confrontation would have to be resolved eventually in one direction or the other. We win, they lose. Now, he didn't mean that by military means, but he did understand that you had to build up your military in order to make sure that the Soviet Union couldn't obtain its objectives outside the negotiations. Now they would go into the negotiations seriously.
Right.
And he brought that off just perfectly, it seems to me. He also he wasn't just interested in stability and coexistence with the Soviet Union. He wanted to move that needle towards freedom. And that was a difference, I think, especially with Richard Nixon, for example, and maybe the Kissinger wing of the party. But he did this thoughtfully. He did it incrementally. I don't think he even envisioned 63 countries becoming democratic after the end of the Cold War.
And why does that matter today?
Yeah, because we are now facing, once again, the resurgence of authoritarian governments in the world who have a very different approach to their own people, let alone to the people of the world. It's now represented even perhaps more seriously in China than in Russia. But the two of them together now represent, I think, a significant challenge for the United States and bring these two regions together.
I want to get back to unity in a second, but let's just go to the third. I want to double back.
The economic reformation that he brought about. The economy was in bad shape in the 1970s. That was, in fact, the deepest recession we've had since the Great Depression in the 1930s. He turned that all around. He turned it around by providing a viable alternative to the Keynesian alternative, which was a tax and spend policy, regulate. He really he moved the country and he told the country that, look, we can do this with policies that cut taxes, that restrain the supply of money, that ultimately over time will bring growth, substantial growth, and eventually will also pay for itself. Now, that was a very controversial argument in the early 1980s, but the way it turned out, that's exactly what happened. In effect, the money that Reagan spent on defense in the 1980s led to the end of the Cold War, which then produced a tremendous peace dividend in the 1990s, which is primarily responsible for the budget surpluses that we achieved. So he got all of the different pieces. He got the monetary restraint, which controlled inflation. He got the tax cut approach, by the way, which gives the American people the chance to decide how to spend money rather than the Congress and special interest groups. That was why tax cuts were always in Reagan's mind, by the way. He talks about them in the 1940s because it was, for him, the way of free choice for the American people to allocate resources rather than always do that through government where, the legislature and, most importantly, special interest groups are going to dominate.
Just on that point, Reagan President Reagan was unlike a lot of the political leaders we see today in the sense that this was not the voice that looked to demonize the other.
Yes.
But if there was one place where President Reagan, engaged in that rhetoric of attack and capturing everything in terms of what your opponent is doing wrong, it was bureaucracy.
It was bureaucracy. It was government. Right? It was central government, which that was a part of his approach from the very beginning. He worried, even as a Democrat, in the 30s and 40s, that the central government was going to overreach, and that was a threat to freedom. We had to always be aware of that. So
let's work on each of these backwards. So you had left off with this the economy and the reform that took place, remarkable reform during his presidency, and it was all tied to freedom, individual freedom. Within the conservative movement, there's a number of voices that really have emphasized less on the individual freedom and focus far more on kind of what they call common good conservatism. Right. And here it's really tied to how much we let the market kind of operate on its own versus should we be informing and kind of managing the market so it's providing what's so-called for the common good. How do you see kind of these arguments departing, if at all, from what you're describing here, why Reagan matters?
Right. Well, look, the core of his philosophy was freedom of individual choice. He wanted to do everything he could to make sure that the American people made decisions and always had alternatives in front of them. Now, that applied in his thinking about tax policies. It applied in his thinking about deregulation. It applied across the board. He didn't stop with individualism. He didn't say, hey, look, the purpose of life is just to be a free individual. No, he emphasized the importance of that free individual being marinated, you could say, in the traditions of faith and of our heritage, that is our historical heritage, marinated in the competitive realities of the marketplace, and, by the way, educated by learning about how the world works and making our choices on a solid basis. So the common good emerged from the choices of individuals in Reagan's point of view. There was always a common good, this idea that he was all for robust individualism and that he believed in the wealthy and not the poor. I mean, this is a terrible travesty, really, of Reagan's philosophy. He wanted that individual to be as free as possible, but that individual now would naturally, because we are not islands, would choose to be parts of communities, but you would want them to choose those communities and, if they want to, leave those communities.
And government's role then?
Yeah, government's role was to preserve the basic rules of the system in the Declaration and in the Constitution.
But not to determine what's good for the good of the community.
Exactly. Never to become so overweening that it could influence these decisions and allow only one decision.
Do you fear Republicans are departing from this outlook? What do you?
Well,
right
yeah. Look, I mean, we're having a good internal debate, which I think is important. But we need to recognize the major differences that we have together with respect to the Liberal Party in our society. And there we are all in, agreement that the government has got to be, restrained. And we have to conduct our politics within the framework of the Constitution, checks and balances. So I think that, and that's where we differ, by the way. Over the years, we've always had this battle between the Hamiltonians and the Jeffersonians. Right. One wanting a more activist government, the other paying more attention to civil society and trying to maintain as much freedom in the civil society as possible. So I think those groups are still there. We need to bring them together. That's going to take leadership. Hopefully there's somebody out there like Ronald Reagan who can make us realize that we need each other. You don't want freedom without, an anchor in faith and tradition, and in the Constitution. And of course, you also don't want, freedom of choice in a libertarian sense, where all you care about is your pleasure and not the future of the society.
All right, let's move on to the second one, the ideological component, which of course takes us to the international arena. And when you look at China today and you look at the responses that you see in political circles and policy circles, there is a camp that is kind of got heightened sensitivity and looks at the Chinese Communist Party. Don't have to look beyond recent events when the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, traveled to Taiwan, and you had this unbelievable, kind of aggressive militaristic response by the Chinese. And those folks will say, "Hey, this is an adversary. The national security community is there." And then you have others who say, "Listen, look at the economy. Look at this integrated economy, largest trading partner, hundreds of billions of dollars transacted in each direction annually. This is not the Soviet Union. This is not the 1980s. Henry, how do you kind of look at the ideological element that, is what your argument here is, that why Reagan matters today, and then apply it to the real complex challenge that is China? And here I've set it up, you have the security component, which seems quite clear they're an adversary, but the economic side, they're stealing and manipulating and all that. But, American companies are really benefiting.
Yeah. No, China is an economic power. The Soviet Union was never really an economic power.
Right.
Now, they're both.
Was that known, though? I mean, was that we know that now, but in the 1960s and the 70s.
No, by the way,
would we have said that?
The point. No. In fact, the intelligence community was saying exactly the opposite.
Yeah.
In the 1970s, they were saying, in fact, that the Soviets were passing us, that their central government approach somehow or other was doing better.
That only became kind of orthodoxy or kind of the consensus later in the Reagan administration, right?
Yeah.
At the earliest.
Yeah.
But anyway,
exactly.
Something else I've been thinking about, because we tend to just say, the China problem is far more complex than
we lose confidence in ourselves, and we lost confidence in ourselves in the 1970s. When we do that, then we, I think, exaggerate the potential of the adversary. And even though the Soviet Union was declining now, throughout that decade, we saw this monster emerging. Now, there's some lesson in there, though, for China. Yes, China is an economic power, but it's not 10 feet tall. And it has a domestic system which is very inefficient. It has become powerful, and it has become competitive, productive through the global economy.
Right.
The very global economy, open and competitive, that they now want to trash, that they now want to change. And I think we're going to see a slowdown and eventually a decline of the growth of Chinese economic power if we retain confidence in our own system and make sure that we're clearing away a lot of the barnacles and so on that might otherwise prevent our economic growth. But if we do the right things at home, if we can master, continued growth, get a hold of this whole inflation problem that we face, maintain free trade, by the way, with our allies, because that was crucial in winning the Cold War, and then wait patiently while also dealing with the Chinese, building up our military capabilities to confront, that is, to establish the balance of power as we did with the Soviet Union, and then wait for an opportune moment, which I think is coming, when the Chinese are going to be much more willing to negotiate, because they will see that they're not moving forward as they might expect in the economic arena or indeed in the strategic arena.
But the ideological component is applied. I mean, surely from your article and our discussions, it's ultimately, this is a country that at its root is not free.
No.
It's an oppressive regime, centrally run, that Reagan, and I'm sure you can expand this, would look at it as this is unnatural.
Yes. It's bizarre. He referred to the Soviet Union as kind of a bizarre chapter in history. I think he would have the same view about China. Not that the people aren't great, and that the history of the country isn't great, and that eventually, China is going to make its way into the world as a full partner. But to get there, they're going to have to, they're going to have to give their people more freedom.
But that obviously is their greatest concern. That's part, if not the whole reason why that little island, that they lay claim to, bothers them so much, because it is a living testament that Chinese people can live free and prosper.
It's a living testament that there's an alternative, say.
Yeah.
And of course, that's the definition of freedom.
Yeah.
Freedom of choice, you have to have the alternative. Now, they're desperately trying to eliminate that alternative.
Yeah.
I think we've got to stay strong. We've got to really think through more carefully, I think, our defense strategy in Asia, because we're now going to deter by sea and air rather than by land, which we did in the Cold War.
In Europe, yeah, sure.
And draw upon, it's very important for us to remember, draw upon our allies now. We're all strong, powerful, democratic societies. Maybe some recent presidents have put a lot of pressure on the Europeans to spend more on defense. They're now doing it under the shadow of Ukraine, and I think we have to sustain that. We really have to push that, because that's the only basis on which the American people are going to continue to support a global role for the United States. Otherwise, we're going to succumb to this movement that exists out there that wants to pull America back.
Oh, there's no question that the neo-isolationist movement, which their voices within the Republican Party, is fueled by pointing out partners and allies that are not adequately investing, right? And this free rider problem. But going back to China, it wasn't in our prepared script, but I'm curious to get your view on this, because the Taiwan case is quite interesting, using your kind of why Reagan Matters framework here. In fact, you look back and President Reagan, during the campaign in 1980, some people view he stumbled on the Taiwan question because the Taiwan Relations Act had only recently been passed. But if you look at the transcripts, it was President Reagan really struggling not to be with the side that was free. And not that I've seen him say it as much, but it kind of reads this way, that he probably didn't feel like there was much value in this so-called strategic ambiguity that, of course, defined the relationship then and continues to this day. Some believe ineffectively to define the U.S. relationship with Taiwan today.
Well, the big change really that took place in Taiwan between the 70s and the 90s was, of course, the emergence of democracy. I mean, it was a military dictatorship during most of the Cold War. And then Reagan was one, of course, who said, wait a minute, we need them in order to confront communism, all right, both in China and in the Soviet Union at that point, especially in the Soviet Union. And so we're not going to have a saliva test for whether they're free or not.
Right.
But the interesting thing is, just as we did in South Korea, that is, our influence in those countries eventually enabled them to come up with their own kind of democracy. Now there is a Chinese model of democracy in the region, and that really bothers Beijing and leads to their determination to try to do something about Taiwan.
But the ideological component, Henry, though, as it applies to, if you apply it today, would that not lead you and others to say, okay, well, we must stand with Taiwan? That strategic ambiguity is not working for us, and it's not working for free people. And ultimately, China's unambiguous here. They're quite clear.
That's right. And that's the way I think Reagan would see it, because there is now a thriving democracy in Taiwan, and we want these issues to be resolved peacefully. I mean, we're not, in the end, if the Taiwanese people decide freely to join the mainland, I think that was something we've pledged ourselves to accept.
Well, I mean, now
that won't happen, obviously, until the Chinese loosen up internally on the mainland, and they seem to be marching in exactly the opposite direction. No, look, I mean, Reagan, from the very beginning, even as a young man, he was focused on on a world in which there was a spiritual battle going on almost continuously. And I think he always said, you're going to have to fight for freedom every generation. It's not anything you can just assume will be passed on. So he saw the world in terms of that kind of an ideological struggle. He would clearly be focused on the authoritarian character of these regimes, pointing out that that's what makes them afraid of us and makes us afraid of them. We represent two totally different political systems, and we're going to have to resolve this, by the way, incrementally by persuading the Chinese to loosen up. They don't have to become Western, but nevertheless to modernize to the point and to liberalize to the point where they can be a peaceful
Well, that experiment, of
partner.
course, it failed. It was what we tried to do, throughout the end of the 20th century and the start of this century, and
with the Chinese. We gave them every chance.
WTO ascension and the rest. But it is interesting, Reagan's language in terms of it's something every generation needs to fight for. For a while, right? I mean,
Yes.
he said it throughout. I think it's from the time
He did from the very beginning.
Perhaps even before I'm not talking about presidential inaugural. I'm talking about his gubernatorial inaugural address. But for a period of time here, we thought, that was a thing of the past. And then with a vengeance, autocracies have emerged, and we see the threat to freedom. I see you pulling for a quote there.
Yeah, I am.
What do you have up your sleeve?
I am actually. Just a very quick one. In China, now this is something he said in he went to China, I think, in 88.
Yeah, that's right.
87, 88. Here's what he said, just quote, "Our entire system," talking about the U.S. system, "is founded on the appreciation of the special genius of each individual and of his special right to make his own decisions and lead his own life." There he laid it down. I mean, directly for them.
I love that.
He said the same. That's very similar in Beijing. I mean, in Moscow.
The speech in China, which I want to say was it in university, I believe, where he gave it. So subversive in a subtle way, in a sense.
Talking to the next generation.
Correct, and said something to effective. In America, the people rule.
Yep.
Not the party.
He said you've got to give that individual freedom because that's the source of productivity. That's the source of growth. That's the source of strength. Oh, and he also said, you have to have the trust of your government. Your government has to trust in you, all right? To give you the lead.
We the people,
The people.
Let's go to that. The first of the three pieces in terms of why Reagan matters. Your article in National Review that came out recently is on unity. That Reagan was able to unify an otherwise fractured party and a country as well.
Mm-hmm.
Unity is something that eludes us today. So the Republican Party, you have, people who want to see President Trump really, back in office. You have people who want to move on from Trump or Trump supporters. You have people who, were never Trumpers. And that's just on the Trump side of it. Forget about the various issue sets, between common good conservatives and, market fundamentalists and libertarians. What's the recipe you think that could still be kind of used today?
I think the only thing that ultimately can unite the Republicans, as in fact is true of the country as a whole, is a set of ideas. Reagan wrestled for a long time with trying to get his approach, his conservative philosophical approach, organized. I mean, in the 60s, all these speeches he gave, he was constantly working to try to express the American conservative point of view, both domestic and foreign policy, in a way that embraced that 65% of the American people who at the bottom, at the heart, were in fact conservatives. And I'm looking for that in another candidate because it's the issues we need to be concerned about. And yes, there are going to be, candidates associated with this or that group, but we need to be sure that we're addressing the issues that are raised by every one of these groups. And I must say that the populist, you could say the Trump base of the American Party, they raise some very good issues. Mm-hmm. I mean, they are right on target when they worry about, a slow economy that where we're taxed over and over again. They understand that we've got to have growth if we're going to, and so they applauded, for example, Trump's tax cut program. They applauded what he did in the alliance by making sure that the allies understood that they must come up with more help for themselves before they can expect our help. He did a great job on the border, even though it was, you could argue a clumsy and a very controversial way. He stopped the flow of immigrants. He, of course, appointed very, very, outstanding judges, just incredibly outstanding judges to the Supreme Court. So those are issues that the base cares about, and it seems to me the Republicans have to address. Now, I sometimes wonder, somebody ought to go and study Reagan. This is why Reagan matters, because he had to maneuver through he had to maneuver between the Goldwater wing and the Rockefeller wing of the party. And those splits were just as, tough, just as difficult in that period of time as these are today. So I'm hoping, that it can only be done with ideas. It's going to have to be an inspirational view of America that draws all of these elements together. Reagan was very clear about that. He says, I'm not going to agree with everything that they want, and they're not going to agree with everything I want, but they're going to be on board.
So am I to take from this that whereas Reaganism had a recipe for unifying the party and resulting in the politics of addition, right? So you have a mandate measured by not just the electoral college vote, but the popular vote, but really strong majorities. Obviously started, you had the House and then Senate for a bit. Do you not believe that Trumpism could lead to the same results? Is it the view that, hey, 75% of Republicans support Donald Trump, but that doesn't translate into over 50% of the country supporting President Trump? Is that the ultimate concern here? Why you kind of harken back to Reagan and not Reaganism, not to Trumpism?
You've got to do what Reagan did. That is, you've got to create and sustain a majority. And in Reagan's case, you have to do it for a couple of decades. I mean, a couple of cycles for an entire decade, roughly. And of course, Reagan's influence persisted for another 2 or 3 decades. It's still evident today. So that's, you could say, look, in the end, it's the American people who decide whether you're on track or not. And, Trump, unfortunately, wasn't reelected and didn't get a popular majority. So we got to do a better job if we want to bring the country along with us. And so I think that's got to be in the minds of all of the different elements, but most importantly, in the mind of the person who eventually leads the country.
Let's go to one kind of fissure within the conservative movement Republican Party, and one that you've been a leading voice on, and that is conservative internationalism. You have seen the emergence of those, not quite, I put them as neo-isolationists, they are restrainers, and there are different ways, there's different camps, but they all seem to be concerned about the United States, and conservatives in particular supporting a notion of internationalism. You wrote a book on this. Tell us a bit about what conservative internationalism means and how you see different elements in the party reacting to conservative internationalist parties. And I think of it just as a Reaganite foreign policy.
Right. Well, I mean, look, Reagan had an understanding of America embedded in ideas and conservative ideas. That is that the country started something 2.5 centuries ago, started something that had never been tried before. That is to establish a republic of self-governing individuals. Mind you, there were only 2 countries liberalizing at that time. That is in the 18th century. That was Britain and Holland. And those countries, less than 5% of the people actually participated, actually voted. In our first elections, 40% of the white male propertied, citizens voted. Huge jump. And so here we were as a country that was trying something totally new, without a monarch, without a state church, without even a common history, because the colonies had sort of dealt with England individually. And I think Reagan understood that. And we've been now moving that country forward through a civil war and all kinds of difficulties. But for the purpose of showing that this is a viable system of government that can apply elsewhere, and that we can't exist really in the world without realizing that. This is what I think Reagan meant by a shining city on the hill, an example, okay?
And that was the 20th century informed that. And we saw this through World War II.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, that's where it took us. That's when we moved as a powerful country. We moved into the international system as a major player. Now, I think that still applies. I mean, we've had enormous success in all of the countries that have become democratic. Notice they don't go to war with one another to resolve their disputes. I mean, it's a much, much better world than it was 100 years ago. Think about that. I mean, Americans, I don't think, understand that. But think about what Europe was like 100 years ago with all the wars that were going on. Similarly, in Asia. It's a much better world, even though it's going to be difficult for us. But so that was the conservative. Look, the nature of America is conservative in Reagan's view. And it being a shining city on the hill, it's a lot more than just a piece of territory or just a piece of geostrategic,
balance of power.
Balance of power, and the whole works.
It's trying in a non-interventionist way, because I know you're reticent to, employ military and force to realize these outcomes. But at the same time, U.S. leadership and proudly promoting our system of government and the plight of free peoples should be at the heart of our foreign policy.
Absolutely. I mean, it has to be. And it's not that it's not to be, well, it has to be simply because we aren't united by anything other than our system of government. That's what, in fact, unites us. And now we're on that hill where everybody is saying, hey, well, can this thing survive? Is it doing well? Is that kind of a republicanism or democracy? Is it doing well in the world or not? I think the world is going to go with, the flow, so to speak. And in that sense, America is the pivot.
Well, it only does well unless America is doing well and behind it.
Well, correct. I mean, obviously.
Are you concerned that conservatives, you've seen many cycles and, candidates and votes and movements within the conservative movement over the years. Do you feel like we're at a moment where conservative internationalism is at risk?
Yeah, to some extent, because we are cycling. We're cycling away from the overreach, which we got involved in as a result of 9/11. We've done this historically. It's completely understandable, even though regrettable, I suppose, that we then in other words, to 9/11, we overreacted clearly to some extent. We got involved in these so-called forever wars. But look, we've always corrected from that, too, in the past. And I thought,
but it's the overcorrection.
I know. And at the moment, it appears as though there is, in contrast, let's say, to Reagan's time, there is much more support for this idea of pulling back, this idea of letting the allies now who are strong and powerful, let them take care of themselves. Why do we need to always be involved? And I think we're going to have to demonstrate to the American people that, in fact, the allies are working with us and that they're putting some real, resources at stake, including lives at stake. So that's going to be very important in terms of conservative foreign policy. Don't get out in front of the allies. Get out in front of the allies. Make sure that they put at least 50%, I suggest that, as a reasonable sort of metric. We have roughly, I think, 70% of the defense expenditures now.
Right.
And we have only 50% of the GDP of the free world. Well, look, that's a metric we ought to work towards in the next 50 years. And the American people will go along with that. See, they will understand that, well, now we're saying, okay, we're on this republic. We're on trial constantly in the world. We have, however, now a lot of very strong allies. And we're going to work with them, and they're going to work with us to sustain a role in the world.
We need to make sure.
A role in the world that is moderate, that is limited, that only goes with other people into a defense of freedom.
But not leading from behind.
Not leading from behind.
Now, do you think Chancellor Schultz will take up your charge that,
Look, I've been
50% of the expenditures?
The fact that Germany has also seemed to cross, at least put their toes in the water of the Rubicon. They're always...
It took the largest war in Europe since World War II.
They're always ready to pull back. I think we ought to make sure the Germans understand that we're counting on them and the world is counting on them. This is their chance to kind of really demonstrate that they are the center of a Europe whole and free, and a Europe whole and free that's determined to remain free.
Well, we shall see. As they say, we're in a moment we're going to get to our lightning round where we'll ask Professor Henry now to share with us his favorite book on Reagan. It could be one of your own. Reagan quote, Reagan's speech, but you just laid it out for us, but I want to kind of put a finer point. You get a Republican presidential hopeful that calls you up, Henry, and they say, okay, I'm seeking the nomination, and I want to wrap myself in conservative internationalism, a Reaganite foreign policy. What do I say? What are the 1, 2, 3 things I should push for? Clearly, burden sharing with allies, I imagine, will be one of them, and you'll throw the metric of 50% commitment to security because we're 50% of world GDP. What else?
Maintain open markets and competition among free countries. That's very important. I know there's an unhappiness with what's happened with China in terms of trade relations. It hasn't seemed to work. But that's because China is an authoritarian society. Our allies are all free societies. And when you practice open trade with them, you give consumers greater choice, which is the nature of freedom.
So free trade agreements should be okay.
Free trade agreement. There ought to be a new rubric, by the way, for those free trade agreements. Reciprocity. Mm-hmm. All right. Not sweetheart deals. all right, where they give us support on the strategic side and we give them special benefits on the economic side. I think that era is over.
All right. So no, you can't give them, you can't allow for subsidies. It's got to be free. Okay.
No, they've got to do it. Or if they have subsidies, we have subsidies. In other words, you're gonna match them in terms of your access to their market has to be the same as their access to our market.
I mean, even the Trump administration did this, USMCA, right? Which was
Trump, he renegotiated these agreements. I thought that was very appropriate. By the way, most of the new agreements have survived, and most people think they're pretty good. So, that's something that we have to emphasize. You do not trade with adversaries.
Don't trade with adversaries. Get free trade agreements with allies.
That means we have to unravel a lot of our interdependence with China. China, by the way, is doing it for us.
Well, the decoupling is happening.
Yep, decoupling is happening. Deglobalization is going to take place, at least between China and the rest of the world. What we need to do is hold together Western globalization, because in the end, that's what's going to defeat them.
Okay, the candidate, last one. Put you on the spot here. The candidates, okay, free trade is good. TPP was something that, the Trans-Pacific Partnership trade deal that Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump famously opposed. You're saying China, we're going to pull out, but then we got to pull in our partners, friends, allies into trade agreement. Would we have a TPP?
Yeah, I mean, look, you can't defeat something with nothing. In the case of China, we failed to counter. What we didn't like about that, we had a Pacific agreement in the works, and when we pushed that, but then suddenly pulled back from it. You need to offer something to compete with the Chinese, because they're now obviously trying to set up relationships that are more in line with their the nature of their system. So you need to do that. You also need to, I think, make some sensible decisions domestically. Reagan always believed that you can't do anything internationally, either economic or military, unless your domestic economy is functioning properly. Yep. And we're facing some very, very difficult times, I think.
Well, in the context of inflation, 8.5%, that needs to be addressed.
Get that straightened out. Make sure your domestic economy is buoyant, and then work with allies and unravel your ties with the Chinese and the Russians have made their decision. They want a different kind of world. Okay, let's go. In some sense, we can welcome that challenge and say, okay, let's. And by the way, in order to achieve that peacefully, that is, in order to have that competition peacefully, we need to check and balance them.
All right.
Militarily.
All right. Well, we got the advice here from Henry. Now let's go into the lightning round. Henry, share with us your favorite book on President Reagan.
I have so many of them. I'll take the rest of the afternoon. But let me
get one here for the lightning round.
Well, I mean, I love the 2-volume history, by the way, that Steve Hayward has done. I mean, that's an enormous contribution. Similarly, a 2-volume, especially the later editions of Lucanen's books about Reagan. There have been so many good ones. Paul Kangor really does the best work I know of on Reagan and his faith, and to what extent that influenced the way he operated. Craig Shirley, who's done magnificent books on Reagan, the campaigner. And boy, do we need that now, because it's in the campaign where you bring all these groups together and you establish that conservative philosophy.
In a lightning round, you got 3 books. We're moving on from books. Give us your favorite Reagan speech. I know you've gone back and pulled speeches that people are less familiar with. Which one stands out in your mind?
Yeah, I think the Westminster speech does, because it was also given at a time when things were pretty dark. So you have to read that speech understanding. Most people were saying, my God, what's he talking about? This world is going to hell in a handbasket. And yet he gave that speech. And if you look back at it now, that speech sort of more or less predicted exactly.
June of 1982. And then he saw the impact of the Freedom Agenda.
Yeah, and you've done some great work here at the Institute on that speech. It's online, by the way, folks.
There we go. Some promotion there of Reagan Institute content. Thank you, Harry. All right, and now let's look at the favorite Reagan quote. What do you got?
Favorite Reagan quote. Well, I'll tell you what, here it is. It's a paraphrase of a Jefferson quote. And, Reagan quoted Jefferson 5 times more than he did Hamilton. So it shows you how he would differ to some extent, all right, from the Hamiltonian.
Although I'm told he quoted Lincoln more than any other president.
Well, this is just a comparison between Jefferson and
Hamilton, okay.
5 times more Jefferson. And here's what Jefferson said in his inaugural address about the role of the individual. He said this in his first inaugural, right? If they, meaning the people of the world, are incapable of self-government, as some would have us believe, then where in the world do we find people who are capable of governing others? Right? I mean, you can't govern others until you govern yourself. And so the idea of a self-governing republic is you start with the individual. You don't stop there, but you move beyond it. And it seems to me that's the heart and root of American politics. This is what the Declaration and what the Declaration gives us the rights. The Constitution protects those rights, and it's all for the individual, who, by the way, are equal, right? Regardless of race, color, creed, what have you. And boy, that's the apple of gold, it seems to me, as one of my colleagues once called it, not making exactly the same argument that I'm making, but nevertheless, that is the bedrock of the American dream, and it's the for Reagan, and I think it's the conservative image of America, classical conservative image of America.
Dr. Henry Now, thank you for joining us.
All right, thank you. Appreciate it.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Reaganism. New episodes premiere weekly every Monday on YouTube and all podcast streaming platforms. If you like this episode, be sure to let us know and share with a friend.